Everybody knows what an abandoned building is supposed to look like. Everything covered in dust, silence, nothing that moves. Out here in Hollow County, the empty places have been left for a reason. Just because a place has been abandoned doesn't mean you are alone. I'm writing this down because I can't drive out, and I've stopped believing I'm going to. The road in was 9 minutes off the state route. 9 minutes down the county road, the turn at the dead silo, and then the town. Coming back, I've been driving for what my dashboard says is 2 hours, and the silo hasn't come, and the state route hasn't come, and the mile markers on the shoulder are counting the wrong way. Up. When you're leaving a place, the numbers should fall. Mine climb. So I'm going to write it while my hand still writes it the way I want it to. Start to finish. Hopefully someone finds it and knows what happened. It was the storm that put me here. I'm a merchandiser for Big Sandy Superstore. Not the ones in the cities. My territory is the small stores, the ones an hour past the last exit anybody's heard of, where the manager is glad to see a face and the seasonal set is 3 weeks late going up. I'd finished a reset 2 towns back, left the store dark behind me at 8:45, and I had empty fixtures rattling in the back of the van and a long straight run home ahead of me, and I wanted my own bed. The rain came all at once, like a sheet dropped over the windshield. The wipers couldn't keep the glass clear. I could see maybe 2 car lengths of yellow line, and then nothing. And the state route out there has no shoulder to speak of, and a drop on the right side. So when the sign for the county road came up in the headlights, I took it. It's a shortcut. I'd taken it before, in daylight, hauling a load down to a store that closed 2 years ago. 9 minutes and you come out the far side onto a better road. Everybody who drives that country knows it. The van started acting up before the town. It could have been the water. Old vehicle, hard rain, and the radio went first. It had been off, playing nothing. Then all at once it was playing everything. I don't know how to describe it. Every station at once. A ball game and a weather reading and a church choir and a woman reading numbers, all stacked on top of each other, all coming through clear. That's not how radios work. When 2 stations fight, you get noise. You don't get both. I got all of them. And under it, threaded through it so quiet I decided I'd imagined it, a kid's voice. I couldn't make out a word, but it was in there. I smacked the dash. I turned the dial and it didn't change anything. Then the engine coughed and the dash lights dimmed and I thought, great, the whole electrical's going, and I took my foot off the gas and let it coast. The radio and the lights and the engine all went out together, and I rolled to a stop at the edge of a town with the rain coming down on the roof like gravel. I sat there a second thinking about the radio, about the whole system dying at once and the radio being the first thing to go. The alternator was on its way out. Everything had one reason, and the reason was the van. I got out to look at it. If I'd stayed in the van, I'd have stayed in the van. But you get out to look. That's just what a person does. So I got out into the rain and lifted the hood. And that's when I heard her.
There isn't the Big Sandy Superstore here.
Flat. A little girl's voice, clear across the rain, from up the street where the town was. Not calling for help, not scared, just telling me, the way you'd tell somebody they'd parked in the wrong lot. A child's voice, out in that. 10 o'clock, that rain, a dead-looking town. You don't think. You turn toward it. Then the words caught up. There isn't a Big Sandy Superstore here. She'd named the company like it was painted on the side of my van, except it wasn't. And the van was behind me and dark, and she was up the street ahead of me. She'd said it like she knew what I did, like she knew the only reason a man would stop in a town was to put a store in it, and she was saving me the trouble. She was standing at the mouth of the main street. I could see her because there was a little light somewhere behind her, a window maybe, enough to make her a shape. A girl, 7 or 8, in a summer dress, and the rain was coming down on the whole street, on the road and the roofs and me, hard enough to hurt, and it was coming down all around her and not on her. I could see it. The dress wasn't wet. Her hair wasn't down in her face the way a kid's hair gets. She stood in it dry, like she was standing in different weather than the weather I was standing in. I told myself I had to be mistaken. It was pouring and she was 30 feet off, and there was 1 bad window's worth of light. A thing like that at 30 feet in the rain, I couldn't have seen clear. Then she turned and walked up the street, unhurried, and I went after her. There was a child walking away into a dead town in the dark. I went. At first, it was just a bad town to walk through. That's all it was. A town that's been left goes to pieces in a way you have to pick your way through. And this one had been left a long time. A porch had come down across the first side street, so I went around. The next street ran up into a slide of kudzu and fallen brick, so I went around that. There was standing water at the low points, deep enough to go over my boots, so I stepped wide. Nothing in any of it a person couldn't explain. I was following a kid through a ruin, and the ruin was in my way, and I went around it. And the whole time she was ahead of me, the same distance she'd been at the start. I noticed that without letting it mean anything. I'd walk faster and she wouldn't be closer. I'd nearly jog a few steps and she'd be exactly as far up the street. Never running, never hurrying, just staying ahead the way the moon stays ahead of a car. A kid who knows a town can keep a lead on a man who doesn't. I told myself a lot of things. I called out to her, asked her name, asked where her family was, told her I'd help her, told her to stop. She didn't answer any of it. She just went up the street, and I went after, and the town came apart around us in the rain. I came back to the intersection the first time and thought I'd gotten turned around. It was a real crossing, a proper one, the middle of the town, where it had been a town. 4 corners, and on the corners were the buildings you'd want. A squat brick one with a faded star and the word sheriff still ghosted over the door. A church, white once. A store, hex, a real store, or it had been. Glass front, the kind of place with a phone. Every corner of that crossing was a place a man in trouble would go, and I stood in the middle of it in the rain, and felt something I'd call relief if I hadn't learned better since. I went to the sheriff's office first. I crossed to it and put my hand on the door, and it opened, and I stepped through out of the rain, and I was standing in a kitchen. Not a sheriff's office, a kitchen. Small, close, the wallpaper coming off the walls in long, wet sheets. A stove gone to rust, a table with 2 chairs. A kitchen in a house. The rain was loud on a roof lower than the roof I'd just been under. I backed out. The sign said, Sheriff, over the door I'd come through. From the outside, it was the brick building with the star. From the inside, it had been someone's kitchen. I went to the church. The church door opened on the same kitchen, same peeling paper, same rusted stove, same 2 chairs. The second one pushed out a little from the table like somebody just got up from it. I hadn't crossed the intersection. I'd walked from one corner to the other, gone in a different door, and come out in the room I'd just left. The store then, the store with the phone. I could see it through the glass front, on the wall by the register, the old kind with the cord. I went in. Kitchen. The phone was gone and the stove was there and the second chair was pushed out from the table, and I stood in it with the water running off me onto the floor. Every door in this town opened into this room. Whatever the sign said, whatever the front promised, it was the front of the same kitchen. The kitchen was the only room the town had left. I do this for a living. I set the front of a store so the sign matches what's inside. So a man who came in for a radio ends up walking toward the radios. That's the whole job. The promise on the outside being true to the thing on the inside. And I was standing in a town where every promise was a lie laid over the one true room. And the room wanted me in it. And I went back out into the rain, fast. The girl was in the middle of the intersection, waiting, dry, and up the street past her, the way ahead was the only way that hadn't looped me back. I'd gotten close to her, closer than I'd been. She'd stopped at the intersection, and I'd come out of the store fast, and I was almost on her before I could think, close enough to reach, and I said something. I think I said, please, and she turned around. For less than a second, she wasn't a girl. She got big. That's the only way I can describe what I saw. Her shape swelled up out of the small dress, up and wide and wrong, the size of her coming apart, and where the girl had been there was... I've been trying to write this for a while now, and I keep stopping. It was like the radio. When the radio played every station at once, it was that, but to look at. Everything in the one place, all of it torn through everything else, 100 pictures laid over each other so there was no picture at all. A woman's face, a road at night, a church full of people, a ball game, a kitchen and a kid, none of it holding still long enough to be a thing. And the sound of her changed. She'd been quiet. The voice had been a small, flat, quiet thing telling me there wasn't a store here. And it opened up all at once into all of them. Every station, every voice, and they weren't telling me anything now. They weren't saving me the trouble. They wanted. I don't have a better word. The quiet voice had been asking. This was past asking. Then she was a girl again. Dry, small, the same distance up the street. Waiting. I turned and ran back the way I'd come. Toward the edge of town. Toward the van and the county road and out. That was the first thing I did that the town fought me on. Everything before, the porches, the kudzu, the water, the town had let me go around. It had been in my way, but it had let me by. The second I turned for the edge, it stopped letting me. The streets I'd walked weren't behind me anymore. The kitchen was behind every door I tried, and now it was around corners too. I'd turned to head down toward where the van was, and the street would run me back to the crossing, and the water was deeper every time, and the wallpaper smell of that kitchen was on the outside air now, wet paper and rust, and I could hear the house breathing, a furnace sound, a long wet pull and push, though there was no house. There was a street, there was rain. I ran at the edge of that town like a man throwing himself at a wall, and the town put the wall wherever I ran, and the only direction it never blocked, the only way that stayed open and quiet and easy, was up the main street, toward her, toward the center. I understood then that the pieces of the town falling in on me were the town trying to keep me out of the middle of it, and the easy, open way to the middle was the thing that had been walking ahead of me, being kind. I understood it, and it didn't help me, because I couldn't get to the edge, and a man can only throw himself at a wall so many times. And the one door the whole town was holding open was the one I did not want to walk through. And I walked through it. Not because I stopped knowing, because there was nowhere else the town would let my feet go. Then it eased. I let myself hope. And I knew better. And I hoped anyway. The fighting stopped. I came up the main street and the water wasn't over my boots anymore. The streets stopped folding me back. The breathing quieted down. I came around the last bend expecting the crossing and the kitchen, and instead I came out at the far end of the town, and there was the gas station. The last one before the river. Lit up. The canopy lights on and the glass of the little store bright and dry, and under the canopy, out of the rain at last, at the pump, was my van. Running. Headlights on, wipers going, the driver's door open like I'd just stepped out of it, exhaust curling up white into the cold. I'd left it dead at the other end of the town. I knew that. I'd left it dead with the hood up in the dark a mile back, and here it was under the lights, running, pointed at the road out, warm. And I got in it. Because it was my van, and it was warm and dry and running, and the road home was right there in the headlights, and everything behind me was that kitchen and that breathing, and the wall the town kept putting up. And in front of me was my own van and the way home. A man can know a thing is a trap and climb into it anyway, if you make everything else worse than the trap. That's what the town did. It didn't fool me. It made the trap the only warm place left. I pulled out onto the road and pointed the van at home, and I was almost crying with it. The heater on my hands and the wipers going and the road unspooling in the lights. She was in the back seat. I saw her in the mirror, and I said what I said, and it's the worst thing in here, and I don't understand it. I said, "You warm enough back there, sweetheart? Not far now." Easy. The way you'd talk to your own kid on the long drive home. Like she'd been back there the whole way. Like I'd been driving her home all along, and just now thought to check she was warm. I don't have a memory of deciding she should be there. I don't have a memory of being afraid of her being there. I looked in the mirror, and there was a little girl in my back seat, and my whole body said, "Of course, we're going home." And I drove. And the radio came on. Not all at once this time. Slow. A song first, coming up out of the quiet under the heater fan. An old one, a man's voice taking the long way home, asking real easy who'd be left to blame once he finally settled down. Like the town had gone looking for the one song that was about me. I even reached to turn it up. Then the other stations came up under it, one at a time. The ball game, and the weather, and the numbers, and the choir, filling in behind the song the way they'd filled in that first time by the town. And I kept driving, and the mile markers on the shoulder went by, and I watched them because I know that road, and they were climbing, going the wrong way. Up. "Almost home," she said behind me. Not flat now, warm, reading it back to me off my own face. And that's when I looked for the silo and the state route, and started to understand that the road wasn't going to give me either one. I don't know how long I've been driving. The road's still going. The markers are past 100 now and climbing, and the song keeps coming back around to the start, like it's the only song there is. The man's still taking the long way home, still asking who'll be left to blame. And the other voices are getting up over it, all of them, every station, the way it was by the town, but louder and closer and inside the car now, and some of them are in my own voice. That's the thing I want to get down while the getting down is still mine. Some of the voices coming up out of the radio are saying things in my voice, things I said. "You warm enough back there?" "Not far now." Already in there with the ball game and the choir, already filed, already one of the stations. She's not in the mirror anymore. She's just the voice now. All of it. The whole radio. And it's not ahead of me, and it's not behind me. 4 of us went into the Merrick Works on the 9th of October. 3 didn't come back out. I still don't know which of them to grieve is murdered, and which is just gone somewhere that isn't quite dead. The channel posted the footage 2 days after they pulled me out at the river gate. Posting the footage is what the channel does. 41 minutes, 11 million views last time I checked. People have gone frame by frame through every second of it looking for the moment it resolves. And there isn't one. I've watched it more than any of them. I know where every clang in the dark lines up with every shape that might be a shoulder, might be a support beam catching the light wrong. I still can't tell you if a man built himself a body count at the Merrick Works, or if the works kept a man around to take the blame for what it does on its own. I can only tell you what the 4 of us saw. We ran a channel called Vacant Signal. It was 3 years old. Built on the promise that we'd get inside places most people only saw in drone footage, and something would happen while the camera was rolling. I built that promise. I'm the one who stood in front of derelict hospitals at 2 in the morning and said I felt something behind me, when what I mostly felt was the cold and the weight of the gimbal rig on my shoulder. My brother Jesse ran sound and thought the whole format was a con we were running on people who wanted to be scared for free. He said it to my face, and on camera, more than once. I kept the cuts in because the arguing tested well. He still showed up for every shoot. He'd been doing the pre-entry check since we were teenagers, sneaking into the Ridgeline paper plant back home. Walking a crowbar out ahead of him to test a floor joist before either of us put weight on it. He wasn't going to stop just because he decided the ghosts were fake. He was the reason I'd walked out of every derelict building we'd ever shot in. Roman believed all of it, no performance in him anywhere. He carried an EMF meter he'd paid $400 for and trusted with his life. Sasha was the newest member of the team. We hired her to edit. She ended up in front of the camera because she was the one who'd go one room further than anybody else wanted to. She had a rule she said out loud on every shoot, that the last room in any building was where the real footage lived. We crossed the Cass River into Ferris County a little after 4 that afternoon. A county cruiser sat at the far end of the bridge. The deputy stepped out and leaned into my window before we'd even cleared the rail, Halloran on the tag over his pocket. He looked past me at the gears stacked in the back seat and said the mill wasn't worth it. He said it flat, like he'd said it to other people before us and it hadn't worked on them either. Roman got most of it on a lav mic. We called Halloran the crank in the group chat before we were even off the bridge. "Free B-roll," Jesse said, and meant it as a joke. We hadn't come looking for a man named Merrick. We'd come for a building. 4 stories of brick and broken sawtooth roofline. Standing over the river with Merrick Works still legible on the water tower, if you squinted. The name found us on its own. A brass plate screwed to an office door on the 2nd floor. It was green everywhere except where a hand had kept it wiped clean. A. Merrick, plant manager. Then a service award photo behind that same door. It showed a man in a collared shirt with a face so ordinary none of us could have picked him out of a lineup. It was dated 1958 in a jeweler's stamp along the bottom. Roman wanted it to be a haunting from the first nameplate. Jesse wanted it to be nothing. Said every dead mill has a manager's name on a door somewhere, and that's not a story. The thing that stopped him for a minute was the ledger. We found it in a records room on the 3rd floor, spine cracked. The handwriting on the first page matched the handwriting on the last page. The dates between them ran 40 years apart. The shift tallies never once added up to the number of names listed under them, not on one single page. None of us could decide if that was just bad bookkeeping or something else. Roman did the math on the dates out loud and grinned like he'd won something. Jesse said there were 2 Merricks, father and son. The handwriting was similar because a man learns his father's handwriting, sometimes on purpose. Then Sasha turned to the very last entry, a shift tally, dated 11 days before we walked in. Nobody argued that one for a while. We kept finding a building that had a person it didn't need. A hallway light at the far end of a corridor came on while we were 50 feet from any switch we could find, and the lights stayed on after we checked every one of them. Jesse said it was an old wiring shorting on a loop. Roman filmed it in total silence. I heard the audio later. He was praying under his breath, low, the kind that isn't a performance for a camera. I called it content gold, out loud, into my own lav mic. The way I called everything on every shoot, and Jesse gave me a look for it that I'm still working out how to describe. Not anger, something closer to disappointment landing on a person he'd already decided not to expect better from. The room that got to all 4 of us was smaller than either of those. A supervisor's break room off the boiler floor, and in it a cot with a blanket folded at the foot, and on the shelf a coffee tin still half full. None of it under the dust that owned every other surface in that building. Someone had been sleeping there, recently. Whoever or whatever it was, it kept house. We found the catwalk over the main floor a little after full dark, and that's when the works did the thing that's on every clip anyone's ever cut from this video. Below us, 100 feet of dead machinery, looms and rollers that hadn't turned since before any of us were born. Then, one stretch of it wasn't dead. A conveyor 30 feet down running an empty belt in a slow loop, a bank of work lights holding a weak amber glow over it, steam breathing out of a joint that should have been bone dry for decades. Down at the far end of that lit stretch, small with distance, one shape moved along the line the way a man moves when he's checking a station he's checked 10,000 times before. Roman had the camera up before any of us said a word. None of us could tell if that shape was walking the belt or being carried by it. None of us could tell if we were looking at a dead building coming back to itself for reasons that had nothing to do with us, or one man, still doing his shift, still checking his stations. 40 years after everyone else clocked out for good. Jesse's hand found my shoulder up there, and he didn't say it was fake. That's the part he'd have denied later, if he'd gotten a later. We took the stairwell down to get closer, because that was always going to be the decision we made. On the second landing, something let go above us. A length of pipe came off the wall in the dark and took the rail out an arm's length from where Sasha stood, close enough that she felt the wind off it. Jesse had the mounting bracket in his hand 30 seconds later, rusted clean through, and said that's what 50-year-old iron does when 4 people start putting their weight on a structure never rated for tourists. Roman said the angle was wrong for a fall, that the pipe had come off the wall sideways, like something had thrown it down the stairwell shaft instead of it simply letting go. He wasn't wrong about the angle. Neither of them could make the other one wrong about the way they saw it. 2 flights down, Roman put a boot through decking that looked as solid as anything else on that floor, and dropped to his waist before Jesse got a hand under his arm. Jesse said rot, pointed at daylight-colored wood dust still hanging in the beam of his light. Roman said the boards on either side of the hole were fine, that only the one board under his foot had gone, and asked, which kind of rot does that? That was the first time the group split on a single event, and stayed split on it, out loud, mid-shoot. Jesse wanted to call it, pack it in, said the place had a squatter with a grudge and code violations. Roman wanted to push forward, said we'd never get closer to proof than we were right then. I said we'd keep going, because I'd built this channel to walk toward exactly this kind of disagreement. Some part of me I'm not proud of was already thinking about how the disagreement itself would cut in the final video. Sasha didn't weigh in either way. She was already 10 feet down the next corridor, with her light on the floor in front of her, listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear yet. We lost Sasha on the 4th floor, in the finishing room. The ceiling had come down in 3 places and left column-sized gaps you could put a hand through. She was 10 feet ahead of the rest of us, chasing a sound she swore was a second set of footsteps under our own. Roman heard it too. Jesse didn't, or said he didn't. We came around a baling machine the size of a delivery truck, and she wasn't there. Her light was, sitting upright on a shelf, like she'd set it down on purpose. It was aimed at a gap in the floor, wide enough for a body, dark enough that our lights didn't find a bottom in it. Jesse got down at the edge and called her name until his voice gave out. He argued the whole time that the floor down here was as rotten as anything we'd already seen, that she'd been moving too fast to test it the way he tests everything. Roman wouldn't come near the edge. He said no sound leads a person 10 feet ahead of a group unless it means to. Said something had wanted her that far out in front and taken her the second it had the room to itself. The hallway behind us didn't look like the hallway we remembered coming down. We spent the better part of an hour rigging a line down into that gap with whatever we had. Camera straps knotted to a tripod leg, and it never found a floor. Jesse wanted to lower himself in after her. Roman physically stood in front of the hole to stop him. For the first time all night, the fight wasn't about what was doing this. It was just 2 men who both wanted to be the one who went down and got her. Neither of them did. We never found which one of them was right about how she'd gone. We never found her. Jesse found the loading dock stair on the way back, a straight run to a door with a strip of real night showing under it. Cold, outside air we could feel from 30 feet off. For a few minutes it felt decided. We were leaving, calling it in from the truck, letting someone with a badge and a search team go back in for Sasha in daylight. Jesse had his hand on the bar before he'd even reached it, already talking about which highway patrol post was closest. The door was locked from a side that had no lock on it. Not swollen shut, not rusted. We checked. Locked. Jesse hit it twice with his shoulder, then just stood there with his palm flat against the steel. None of us said out loud what that meant. Something in this building had decided we weren't done yet. We found another way down through the boiler house, and that's where we lost Jesse. A valve gantry ran above the old accumulator tank, a catwalk maybe 2 feet wide with a single handrail. Jesse crossed it first, some habit left over from testing floors for me 20 years ago that he'd never once broken. Halfway across, a steam main that had no business being pressurized let go at a coupling 6 feet from him. That boiler hadn't fired since the plant closed. Roman kept saying it after, like saying it enough times would undo what we'd watched. The line blew in a wall of scalding white and put Jesse down on the catwalk, and by the time Roman and I got across to the wheel and shut the flow off, the sound Jesse had been making had already stopped sounding human. When the steam cleared enough to see, my brother wasn't on the catwalk anymore. Not below it either, not in the tank, nowhere. Roman's light couldn't find him in the time we spent trying. The wheel that shut that line off was warm under my hand when I got to it. Warm, and gripped clean of 40 years of grime in a hand-shaped patch on the rim. Somebody's hand does that to a valve. Machines don't turn themselves warm. I don't have a clean understanding of that night anymore. I have Jesse's hand on my shoulder on the catwalk above the running conveyor, not 2 hours earlier, telling me, without saying it, that even he wasn't sure what was happening. I have the sound he made. I have a valve wheel somebody had used, gripped and turned and left warm. No one should have been in that building to have turned it. After that, I became my brother. I took up the argument he couldn't finish, and I would not let it go. It was a man. It had always been a man, some squatter who'd made a life out of this building and a game out of the 4 of us. Every single thing we'd filmed had a simple explanation. I said it to Roman on the stairs that we'd going up. The theory being that up was away from the boiler house and away from anything with a valve wheel in it. I said it loud enough that saying it felt like doing something. The alternative was that my brother had died because I built a channel that made walking into buildings like this one feel like content instead of what it actually was, and I was not ready to face that yet, so I carried his argument instead. We found the record room on the top floor by accident. We were looking for a way onto the roof. Filing cabinets, most drawers water-damaged past reading, except one folder somebody had kept dry on purpose, boxed, shelved above the flood line. County inspection paperwork from the 1987 closure. One line near the bottom of the cover sheet, typed, not handwritten. Sole surviving officer, A. Merrick Jr., deceased, 1974. No heirs of record. There was no living Merrick to have written in that ledger 11 days before we came in. There was no man left for Jesse's argument to be about. I stood there, wanting it to prove the other thing instead, and it wouldn't do that either. It didn't hand me a ghost. It took away the last man I had to blame and gave me nothing back in his place. Somewhere below us, faint enough that I told myself it was wind finding a broken window, something that sounded like a shift's worth of footsteps started up again. The tally in my head still didn't add up to one man, same as it never had. Roman and I ran the rest of the way together, and I use the word run loosely, because most of it was crawling through gaps the ceiling had made for us and hoping the floor under each one was better than the floor that had taken Sasha. The lights kept doing what they'd been doing all night, on ahead of us where no one had touched a switch, off behind us the second we'd cleared a room, walking us down a route neither of us had picked. That didn't match the route we'd mapped coming in. Roman kept saying it was herding us out, that it wanted us gone. For the first time all night, I started to believe him. Twice on the way down, a door we'd left propped was shut when we reached it. Both times we found another way around. We both noticed, but never said anything about it. I lost him at the last gate. A rolling door, chain and pulley, half down. Roman went under it first to work the chain from the other side for me. I heard the chain run and the door come down the rest of the way. It seemed to come down faster than gravity should have dropped it. Roman didn't call out from the far side. I hauled it back up myself. I cut my hands on the links. When the door finally came up, there was no one there. Just the yard, the fence, the river past that. There was a shape standing at the gap in the fence where we'd cut in 8 hours before. Tall, at the exact place I needed to go through, not moving toward me and not moving away. I had 2 seconds of light on it before my battery finally gave out. In those 2 seconds, it did one thing. Stepped aside from the gap. Just enough that a body my size could get through it without touching whatever it was. The footage cuts here. Battery, or something else that wanted it to end. I don't remember the run to the road. I remember Halloran's cruiser lights, parked in the same spot on the bridge. It was like he'd been sitting there since we crossed it going the other way. He didn't ask what happened. He looked like a man who'd already had a good idea of how the night was going to end. The footage went up 2 days later. I'd like to tell you I fought that. I didn't. Not hard enough to mean anything. It's the best 41 minutes vacant signal ever shot. I know exactly how that sounds coming out of the one person in it who's still around. People ask me in the comments whether it was Merrick, whether it was ever a man at all, whether my brother's skepticism got him killed or got him vindicated. I still don't have an answer for them. I go back to the footage more nights than I'd admit, always looking for the one frame that finally settles it, something that proves him right or proves him wrong. It just isn't in there. It was never going to be in the footage. Somebody posted a second angle last month, a doorbell camera 2 properties down from the bridge, time-stamped the night we went in. It shows the 4 of us crossing. It shows Halloran's cruiser. 40 minutes later, on a night none of the rest of us were anywhere near that stretch of road, it shows one more person crossing the bridge alone, heading towards the mill. I've watched that clip more than I've watched anything Roman or Jesse ever shot. I can't tell you if it's Merrick, walking to a shift he never clocked out of. I haven't looked in a mirror at 4 in the morning since I found that clip. I checked the view count instead. It's still climbing. It'll probably still be climbing after I'm done telling you this. I still have the notebook written by a person that wasn't able to escape the dead town. It sits in a drawer in my apartment. Some nights I take it out, turn it over once or twice, then put it back closed. I've told myself a dozen reasons for that. None of them hold up. The real reason is simple. I'm afraid of what's inside. Afraid it will confirm what I already suspect, and once it's confirmed, I won't be able to pretend the town let me go for reasons of its own. I went looking for a legend. I found a dead town straddling a county line that didn't want visitors. It took most of a night to understand why. This isn't a reading the notebook I found there. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. This is what happened before I picked it up, and how I got out, still carrying it. I do field work. Not the kind with a university letterhead behind it. The kind you do because you can't stop. Because a story keeps reappearing in 3 counties under 3 different names. My method is simple, or it sounds simple when I explain it at a bar. Legends and folktales aren't lies. They're functional. A story survives because it's doing a job for the people telling it. If you can figure out the job, you understand the town better than any official record will tell you. Most legends warn people away from something real. A bad curve in the road, a bad family, a bad year nobody wants to name directly. Find the warning underneath the story, and you've usually found the soul of the town. I'd been chasing this one for over a year. A stretch of road that swallows travelers, retold at gas stations and church suppers as the corridor. A driver takes a wrong turn near a county line. The road doesn't let him back out the way he came in. Everyone had a version. Nobody had a source. That's usually the tell that a legend is still alive, still being fed by a community that keeps it circulating out of something more than habit. By the time I found the town, I had a dozen tellings of the same story in a notebook of my own, all second-hand, all strangely convenient, the road supposedly only taking people who go looking for it. I wrote that down without turning it on myself. That's the kind of blindness a methodology doesn't fix. I came at the town from the far side, away from the gas station everyone in my notes kept mentioning. I expected porch lights. I expected somebody's grandmother willing to talk if I brought coffee and enough patience. What I found instead was a town with no one in it. Not abandoned in the tidy sense, but caught mid-collapse and left that way. Half of it was sinking into kudzu and river silt, wet rot working through porch boards, the air thick. Half of it was rusting into rebar and sheared steel, dead plumbing jutting out of collapsed floors like ribs. I remember thinking that was strange before I thought it was wrong. A legend needs people to tell it. A town this dead had no one. I was going to have to be my own witness to the town. The van sat at the edge, where the town's outer road gave up being a road. I recognized the model before I saw what was inside it. An old panel van, doors hanging open, paint gone chalky under years of weather. The windshield had a spiderweb crack radiating from one point, like something had hit it once. The body in the driver's seat had been there long enough that it was mostly bones. They had settled into the upholstery, clothes gone stiff and gray, a posture that still looked like a man who'd been driving. I should have turned around right there. Instead, I stood at that open door and felt something close to relief. A body meant the legend was real. I'd spent a year chasing a story that might have been nothing. Here was proof I hadn't wasted that year. I tried my phone, meaning to call someone and report the body. No signal, which didn't surprise me. I decided I'd report it on the way out. I looked for a name, registration, wallet, anything with a name on it. There was nothing in the glove box but a road atlas gone soft with damp. No plates I could read under the rust. Nothing in what was left of his pockets. Whoever he'd been, the van wasn't going to tell me. On the passenger seat, wedged half under the body, was a notebook. Handwritten, water-warped, the cover gone soft, held shut with a rubber band gone brittle. I took it. I put it in my jacket. I didn't open it that night. I figured I would read it later. I noticed odd things, small enough that I could explain each one away as I found it. A pair of shoes on a porch step, lined up too neatly, toes pointed at the door like someone had set them there on purpose. Could have been anyone. People leave shoes. A coat on a hook inside a house with no roof left. The beams above it had gone soft and dark with years of weather. The coat itself showed no rot at all, no fading, like it had been hung there that morning. Lucky angle of the weather, maybe. Some spots stay dry. A photograph on a mantel, colors still sharp, propped in a room where the wallpaper had turned to pulp behind it. Some houses hold up strange. I'd seen it before, in other towns. A machine part, a gear, oil black, teeth still sharp, sitting square in the center of a kitchen table, like a place setting laid for dinner. A child's shoe, alone, on the floor of what used to be a mill, nowhere near anything that explained it. A doorway I passed twice, an hour apart. The first time it stood open. The second time it stood shut. I couldn't remember whether I'd closed it. I decided I had. Each one, on its own, was nothing. None of them stood out to me individually. Each had a shrug of an explanation attached. It was only when I looked back at a street I'd already walked and saw a chair that had been set against a wall, now standing in the middle of the road, that a pattern started to needle at me. I told myself the wind. I have a long list of things I told myself that night. My training was working against me. I read situations for a living. That night, I was reading this one wrong, one confident step at a time. The first time I saw her, she was in a doorway with no door left in the frame. I didn't see her clearly. A glow, low and orange, like a hearth banked for the night, somewhere back in the dark of a house I hadn't gotten to yet. When I moved to get a better angle, the glow resolved into a hunched mass at the far end of a hallway. It was too large, like the house had been built around it. One limb caught the last of the light. Porchwood, warped and gray, wound through with what might have been pipe, might have been root. It might have been both. I thought, predator or squatter. I backed out of that doorway with my heart going hard. I was already reaching for my flashlight that would have done nothing against something that size. Everything in my training said danger radiates from stillness that watches you. She was still. She watched. I filed her under threat and kept moving. The objects made sense to me now. They were hers, evidence of a hand, and I'd finally found the hand behind them. I saw her a second time not long after. She was in a different house. A mass in the dark at the end of a hall. Wallpaper and dead ivy grown so thick through each other, I couldn't tell where the wall ended and she began. I didn't wait to see more. 2 fragments were enough to build a monster out of. I didn't stop to ask why a monster would leave a trail instead of a trap. The town started fighting me in earnest after that. It fought smart. It started small, and it escalated. First, it made itself hard to see through. Every window on the way toward the center had gone opaque. Not with grime, but with a strange, hard shine. When I pressed my face close to one, I saw my own face pressed back instead of whatever room lay behind the glass. I tried 3 more windows on 3 more houses. Same shine, same reflection, no exceptions. I tried a back door I could see clear through from 10 feet off. Up close, it had gone the same way as the rest. I couldn't find the center by looking for it anymore. I could only feel which direction seemed to be the path of least resistance, and go that way instead. Then it started closing up. Not the doors out, the doors in. Every hallway that looked like it would lead deeper ended in a door, hinges fused solid, handle immovable no matter how I threw my weight against it. The doors that opened back toward the part I'd already walked. It felt like the whole town was herding me away from its own center. I stood in one hallway and counted locked doors on both sides. 6 of them, all the way down, every one facing deeper into the house than the one before it. When closing up wasn't enough, it flooded. Not a flood in any normal sense, but black, low, ankle-deep pooling specifically across the paths that led inward and nowhere else. The dry ground was always behind me, never ahead. It was thick with something that might have been mold or rot. It was cold enough to ache in my teeth through my boots. At first I thought it was low ground, normal. That lasted until I backtracked half a block and found the street behind me bone dry. The same street I'd have sworn was flooded 20 minutes earlier. I noted the strangeness of it the way I'd noted the shoes and the coat. I filed it. I kept walking forward into water. By the time it stopped bothering to obstruct me and started simply moving me, I'd stopped being just surprised. I was afraid now. The specific fear of understanding a pattern was escalating with no way to make it stop. The square rearranged itself under my feet, not visibly, never while I was looking, But every time I crossed it, certain of my direction, I came out the far side somewhere I'd already been. I crossed it a second time, correcting for the first mistake, and ended up further from the center than when I'd started. A third time put me back almost to the van. The whole town was resetting the board, moving me back toward where I started. Somewhere in the middle of it, twice, maybe 3 times, I caught a flicker at the edge of my vision that wasn't the monster's work at all. A girl, or the shape of one, always at a distance, always in a doorway or a window. She always looked like she belonged there. A radio somewhere behind her, playing something warm and tinny, almost welcoming. It was gone the moment I turned to look at it directly. She never advanced, she never fled. She was just present, waiting. The one thing in that entire siege that wasn't actively trying to move me. I had no room in my head for her. I had a monster to get past, one that was actively locking doors and drowning streets in front of me. She wasn't the one fighting me, so she wasn't the one I watched. I found the way through by accident, or that's how it felt at the time. A gap between 2 houses the water hadn't reached, that no door had sealed, narrow enough that I had to turn sideways to fit through it. On the other side, the ground sloped up toward a square I hadn't seen yet, and past it, something that could only be the center, its shape wrong in a way I couldn't quite describe from where I stood. I felt like I'd won. I'd fought a monster for the better part of 2 hours. Locked doors, mirrored windows, flooded streets, a square that kept sending me back toward my start, and I found the one gap she couldn't close. Standing in it, I felt something close to triumph. The town's whole arsenal beaten by persistence and a body-width gap between 2 buildings. I didn't ask myself why that gap was there. I didn't ask why the one seam in an otherwise total siege happened to open exactly toward the thing I most wanted to reach. I just walked through it, already composing how I'd tell this part later, already certain the hard part was behind me. The pull started before I understood there was anything to resist. It wasn't the objects, and it wasn't the monster's tactics. Those had all fought me every step. This was different. This felt like arriving somewhere that had been waiting for exactly me. It was warm in a way the rest of that cold, wet town wasn't. The air changed, the light changed, gold instead of gray. Somewhere ahead, past a threshold I hadn't decided to approach, was the sense, not the sight, the sense of an answer. Every question I'd carried into that town for a year, resolving all at once. All for me. What happened to the driver, what the corridor actually was, why the town died, why I'd been let this far. I could feel the shape of the answers without hearing any words. My stomach turned before my mind caught up. I didn't reason my way out of that pull. Something in me recoiled from it. Before I could say why, my body already knew. I stopped walking. I stood at the edge of that light with every part of me straining forward, one small part of me refusing the next step. For a long moment, I didn't know which side was going to win. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a vision. It was closer to the feeling you get walking into a home. Your chair already pulled out, coffee ready exactly as you take it. Except the house was a town, and the chair was an answer to a question I'd spent a year asking. And some part of me wanted to sit down so badly it took everything I had not to. Only in the telling of it, did I find a name for what I'd felt. Standing at that threshold, I understood I was the only audience that town had left. Everything I wanted, resolving exactly on cue. But it wasn't a resolution. It was a lure with manners. I did not cross that line. I stopped at the edge. I didn't go further. Understanding arrived in the same breath as the stopping. I didn't work it out so much as have it appear whole, the way a shape resolves out of static once you stop trying to force it. The monster hadn't been the danger. She'd been trying to keep me out of it. Every locked door, every mirrored window, every flooded street, none of it had been an attack. It had been a hand on my chest all night, pushing me back from the one thing in that town that actually wanted to take me. I'd spent hours fighting the only thing on my side. I turned around. That's the whole of the decision. I faced the direction the monster had been hurting me toward the entire time. For the first time since the van, she and I wanted the same thing. I hadn't beaten her. I'd finally agreed with her. One step short of too late. Getting out felt like being carried more than walking. The current that had fought me all night was suddenly at my back instead of in my face. It was moving me toward the edge with a pressure that didn't feel like anything I had a word for. Just patient. Just enormous. Hurting me the way you'd heard something you'd decided was worth saving instead of keeping. I don't trust most of what I remember about the walk back. It comes to me now in pieces, out of order, the way the objects had. A street I didn't recognize, the same gap between two houses seen from the other side. A sound like a radio cutting out mid-song somewhere behind me. I remember the van again, the shape still in the driver's seat. I remember not stopping this time. I remember crossing whatever line marked the town's edge and feeling the pressure at my back simply stop. It stopped the way sound stops when a door closes behind you. I remember the notebook, still in my jacket, bound with its brittle rubber band, exactly where I'd put it hours before. Somewhere in the worst of that night, I'd forgotten I was even carrying it. I made it back to my car a little before dawn. I don't remember most of that drive, either. I've had the notebook for a while now. I keep it in a drawer. Every so often I take it out, and I've never once broken the rubber band. I tell people I'm planning to get it examined properly. I tell myself the same thing. Neither of us believes it anymore. Here's what I've come to understand, thinking about it these past months. I got out because something in that town decided that I was worth pushing away. I've built a career on studying why places perform the way they do for outsiders, and I still don't have a good answer for why that one didn't want me for itself. Legends need tellers. I went looking for the town's legend, and I found something, carrying this notebook and this story out with me, the way she carried me out of that square. I got out of the town. I don't think I got out of the town's legend. I don't think anyone does. The road has rules, and I know all of them, and I never break a single one. I can't forgive myself for that. For 11 years, I've driven that route because of my job. It runs from the state route down to the river and back. I am the only man left alive who knows the whole set of rules to survive it. They sound like superstitions, like maybe an old cop has lost his mind on a dead county road. That's fine. The men who thought that are the case files. I'm the one still driving. The first rule is the gas station. It's a good place to start because that's where the night started too. It sits on our side of the river, the last thing before the bridge. It should have closed with everything else out here, but it didn't. The pumps still take a card. The light still comes on. I don't know who trucks the fuel in, and I stopped asking that question a long time ago. The same year I stopped asking a lot of questions about this road. You can get gas there. That's allowed. What you don't do is go inside. I have never been inside, and I intend to keep it that way. There is a second rule inside the first rule. You pump your gas, and if anything changes, if the light flickers, if the little bell on the door goes off with nobody in the doorway, if it seems at all like something has noticed you, you stop. You hang up the nozzle wherever it is, you get in your car, and you leave. It does not matter how much fuel you've got. Half a tank, quarter tank, fumes. You leave. The gas is not worth the price of staying. I've watched people think it's stupid. Not out here. The men out here are past explaining to. But I've tried to tell it to folks who'd listen, then you can see the exact moment they file you under crazy. A gas station can't notice you. A bell is just a bell. Sure, you go stand under that canopy at 2 a.m, the whole county dead around you, the bridge black in front of you, and you tell me a bell is just a bell. That night I pulled in with a little under half a tank, which on this corridor is not enough, because the corridor is long, and there is nowhere else to get gas. I did everything according to the rule. I stood on the far side of the pump so I could see the road and the doorway both, and I ran the fuel, and I watched. I had the nozzle in maybe 30 seconds when the light over the door flickered and came back on. That's all. One flicker. On any ordinary building on any ordinary night, that's a bad ballast and a note to maintenance. I hung the nozzle up with the pump reading a hair over half, and I got in the cruiser and I pulled out. Because that's Rule 1. Rule 1 is easy. The station's wrong in a way that doesn't nag at you. It just makes your skin crawl. Easy rules are the ones that scare you clean. It's the ones that don't scare you that get people. So I pulled out onto the corridor a little after 2, with a little less than half a tank. I started my patrol. I've told you my beat, the state route down to the river and back, all night. It used to be more of a county. There used to be more cops. Now my whole beat is just the road and a bridge at the end of it. Past the bridge is a dead town. It's not in my county. That's Ferris, across the water. I've never set foot in that town, and I never will. This is my side, and I stick to it. I leave the far bank alone. People go missing on this corridor. Not often, a handful of times a year. That's a lot of people to lose on one stretch of road anywhere. And this is a road almost nobody drives. They're not from here. Nobody from here drives it after dark. It's the people passing through. The wrong turn off the closed interstate. The shortcut somebody swore by. The ones who come looking for something. We get looking for ones now. The road's got a reputation in certain corners of the internet. That brings a particular kind of person out to it. I've saved some of them, and mostly I haven't. What I do is take the report after. I drive the road. I know what took them, and I keep driving. There was a recent one, not one of the missing, the opposite of it, which is the part I still can't sit right with. One who got out. He's the reason the night went the way it did, though I didn't know that when I pulled out of the station under half a tank. The patrol is the routine. The routine is the thing that keeps you safe. You drive the same pattern, you answer dispatch when dispatch calls, and you call in when you're supposed to call in. The rhythm of it is a kind of fence you build around yourself all night long. As long as the rhythm holds, you make it through the night. That's the real rule under all the other rules. Keep the pattern. Don't let the road change your pattern. The road spends all night trying to change your pattern. Maybe an hour past the gas station, the radio went wrong. Dispatch and I have a rhythm. 11 years, the same dispatchers. She raises me by my unit number, and I come back with it. She calls me Deputy Halloran, never anything else, and I call her by the desk. It's a cadence older than either of us. That night, dispatch answered me before I keyed the mic. I reach for the mic to call in my position, the way I do at the North Turn every night, and the speaker came alive on its own and gave me the acknowledgement. My unit number, my position, correct, in her voice. A full second before my thumb touched the key. Rule 2. The radio will start to talk to you. It will sound like your dispatcher, but it will be a half step ahead of where it should be. You do not answer it. You run your protocol into it like it's a dead channel. You say your piece the way you would if nothing had answered, and you do not respond to what it says back, no matter how ordinary, no matter how much it sounds like the woman you've talked to every night for 11 years, because it is not her. It is the road. So I called in my position, flat, into a channel that had already answered me, and I didn't acknowledge the answer, and I kept driving. The radio tried a few more times. It called me by my first name once, which dispatch does not do and has never done. I kept my mouth shut and kept driving. It's a bad hour of your life, talking past your own radio like it's possessed, because it is. The whole time some part of you is screaming that ignoring your dispatch is how people die. That's the trick of Rule 2. It uses your training against you. Everything they teach you says, answer the radio. The road knows they teach you that. Then it stopped. The radio came back clean. Dispatch called. Really called. The cadence right, the half step gone, her voice sitting exactly where it should in the rhythm, and gave me a genuine call. A vehicle reported off the state route, a family with kids in the car. They got turned around and were scared. They needed help getting back to the interstate. Real. The kind of call I got into this to take. For a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, I was just a cop doing his job on a quiet road, talking a scared dad back toward the highway, hearing his relief come up over the radio when he saw the on-ramp. 20 minutes of the night being ordinary is a refreshing change of pace. It just doesn't come to much. Some nights the station flickers and the radio gets strange for an hour, and then it lets you be. It happens. I've had them. I let my shoulders down. That was the road setting me up. The quiet wasn't the road letting me be. The quiet was the road clearing the channel for what it actually wanted to put on it. But you never know it in the moment. I thought it was going to be an easy night, and it was just the calm before the storm. The bridge is Rule 3, and Rule 3 is the one about the far bank. The town over there. I told you it wasn't in my county. What I haven't told you is that it wants company, and the road is how it reaches for it. The bridge is the arm, and on certain nights, the far bank will try to bring you across. It started with the light. There's no light in that town. It's been dark my whole life, and that night, past the bridge, deep in where the dead streets are, a light came on. Just one. A window, or something like a window, warm and low, the way a light looks when someone's home and waiting up. And then the wanting starts. The light is just a light, but the second you see it, something reaches into you and turns your wanting toward it, hard, like a hand on the back of your neck. It isn't that the light is inviting, it's that the town has found you looking, and it starts to pull. Everything in you wants to go to it. It looks like the only human thing for miles, and the wanting is so strong and so sudden, you'd swear it was your own. Rule 3. You don't cross the bridge. Whatever's on the far bank stays on the far bank. The light is bait, and the bridge is the arm, and the town is the mouth. And none of it is your county, and none of it is your job. You hold the line at the river. I have held that line 11 years. I sat at the near end of the bridge with my hands on the wheel and the light burning across the water. It's hard to resist the pull once the town has noticed you. The low fuel light was on my dash by then, its own small red insistence. And here's how the road stacks things. The light across the river, the light on my dash, the 20 good minutes still warm in me, under half a tank getting lower. All of it leaning me the same direction. All of it saying, go, do something, move. I sat and I did not cross. The warm light in the dead town went out, the way it does when it's given up on one approach and is reaching for another. Then the radio found the voice. I recognized it the second I heard it. It didn't sound like a stranger doing an impression. It sounded exactly like his voice. Every word of it was his, exact, down to the way he ran out of breath. He'd come out a while back with a little crew, kids making one of those haunted building videos for the internet, and they'd crossed the bridge into Ferris to film the old mill. Only one of them came back. Him. The crew went in and the corridor kept them, all but this one. And I know that because I'm the one who took what passed for the report. And because I'd talked to him before any of it, at the start, when they were still just a car full of kids who thought I was a joke. I'd stood at his window and told him the mill wasn't worth it, and watched him decide I was a crank. And after, when it was over, and he was the only one left, I watched him leave. Out of the corridor, across the state route, gone the safe way, in daylight, alive. Whatever the mill did to the others, it didn't get him. He told his story to people who'd listen, and he went home. He got out. And there he was, on my radio, in my cruiser, at 3 a.m, calling for help. Not a recording. Live. Present tense. Scared in a way he hadn't been at his window that afternoon, when the worst thing out here was an old cop wasting his time. Calling my unit, calling for anyone, saying he was hurt and he was across the river and he couldn't find the way back, and could somebody please come. Rule 4 is simple. The radio mimics the ones who are gone. Their voice comes through at the moment they needed you, exact, still believing you'll come. You do not answer. The person is gone. What's calling is the road, in a voice it copied from someone it took. I have lived by that rule. But this one wasn't taken. I watched him leave, and yet his voice was coming through the radio. So one of two things was true. Either he came back. Some allure I'll never understand brought him back down that road one night, after I'd stopped thinking about him. And this time he didn't leave, and the rule holds, and he is gone after all, and I just didn't know it yet. Or the town has learned a new trick. That's what I believe, mostly, because it's the only way that I can still do this job. The road found a new way to try and trap me. It doesn't only keep the ones it takes anymore, it keeps a piece of everyone who passes through. The ones who leave alive, right along with the ones who don't. It copies the voice, it saves it, and on a bad night, it plays it back. So a voice on my radio doesn't mean a dead man anymore. It doesn't mean anything. Rule 4 used to have a floor under it. You do not answer the ones you know are gone. That's a hard rule, but at least you know they're gone. There's no floor now. If the road can call in the voice of a living person, then I can never again believe a voice across that river. It doesn't matter whose it is. It doesn't matter how sure I am they're alive. It doesn't matter if I helped them out of the corridor myself last week and shook their hand in daylight. Every call from the far bank, forever, I have to treat as the road. I answer none of them. I'll be wrong sometimes and never know it. That's the rule now. Not the ones you know are gone. Just not any of them. Not ever. Whoever it sounds like. I had the mic in my hand. My thumb was on the key before the rest of me caught up. 11 years on this road, 30 years of being a man who runs towards danger, and every one of those years says, when someone calls for help on your radio, you answer. And he was right there. He was scared. He was saying, please. I could have said, I'm coming. I could have said, hold on. 2 words. I'm coming. I had them in my mouth. And I had the cruiser in gear. I was rolling toward the near end of the bridge, one hand on the wheel and one on the mic. The whole of me was leaning across that black water toward a man who needed me. It would have been so easy. The most natural thing a person ever did. Key the mic, say I'm coming, and put my foot down. Then the other voices came up under his. That's what stopped me. Not my discipline. What stopped me was that while I sat there, the radio filled in behind his voice. Other voices, under and around his. It was like a whole channel of voices. I knew some of them, not all, but enough of them. People I'd had to leave to the town over the years. A family I never found. A woman whose case I never closed. Nearly every one I couldn't save, and one I did. Calling at once, on my channel. All of them still at the moment they needed me. All of them still believing somebody would come. The road had them all. It had kept every one of them the way it had kept that kid. Whether it took them, or just let them drive away with their voice already copied, it had them. And it played them for me together. The thing it was saying under the words was so simple. Here they are. Here are all of them. The ones you failed, and the one you didn't. And you can't tell them apart anymore. Come for them now. Cross the bridge, and come. And I understood, sitting there rolling toward the water with all those voices in my ears, what the road had actually built. It hadn't turned my job against me by accident. My whole life is coming when I'm called. The road had gathered up everyone it had ever taken from me, and some it maybe hadn't taken at all. It put them on the one channel I can't stop listening to, calling with the one word I can't refuse. The only way to live was to be, for one moment, the exact opposite of the only thing I've ever been. To hear all of them ask, and to not come. I put the cruiser in park. I took my thumb off the key. I set the mic back in its cradle, slow and careful, the way you'd set down something that would break. I sat there with my hands in my lap and I let them call. All of them. The kid who got out, the woman, the family. I did not answer. I did not cross. It was the worst thing I have ever done, and I did it on purpose, and I would have to do it again in an hour if the road asked. And it will. I don't know how long they called. Long enough. The low fuel light burned the whole time. I watched the bridge and kept my hands in my lap. Eventually the voices thinned, one at a time, until the channel was just static and then just quiet. Then dispatch called. Really called. The cadence right, asking my position, routine. The fence rebuilt. I gave her my position and my voice came out level, which surprised me. I finished my patrol on the fuel I had. I crossed the state route out of the corridor a little before dawn, and I drove home. They never left the channel. Not all the way. It's been years now, but that night was the night it took hold for good. Since then, under every dispatch call, under every ordinary transmission, on every ordinary shift, Lo, threaded through, they're there. The ones I lost, and the ones I only thought I saved. I'll be taking a routine call on a bright afternoon 40 miles from that road, and under her voice I'll hear him, faint, saying please, still at the moment he needed me, still believing. Every call. I hear all of them under the working channel, and I answer the working channel anyway. Because that's the job. I patrol the corridor, and I hold the line at the river. The road didn't take me. I survived it. I did everything right. I kept every rule. That's the last rule, and it's the one nobody survives to teach you. So I'm teaching it to you now. The road doesn't always want to keep you. Sometimes it just wants to make you the kind of thing that leaves the rest of them calling in the dark. And once it's made you that, it doesn't have to keep you at all. 4 places. 4 different ways this county convinces you that empty means safe. Out here, nothing is actually empty. It's patient. And every one of these stories is just a different way of finding that out too late. That's where we'll leave it tonight. If these stories kept you company out there in the dark, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next journey into the unknown. And if you've got a story of your own, someplace you walked into that was supposed to be empty and wasn't, email it to us. We may just tell it here someday. Until then, remember, the easiest lie to believe about an abandoned building is that nothing's home. Because the truth is worse. It was never empty. It's just been waiting for company.